solving one-step equations with integers. By the end of this video, you will be able to solve a one-step equation with an integer. An integer is a whole number, 1, 2, 3, etc., or its opposite, -1, -2, -3. An integer is not a fraction, and an integer is not a decimal. In order to be successful with this lesson, you need to be able to do these three things: identify the variable, determine the inverse operations, and use a property of equality to isolate the variable. So let's get started. The first thing you need to do is locate your variable. Sometimes the variable's on both sides, but since we're starting from the beginning here, we'll keep it simple. The variable will either be on the left or the right. That's where you begin. The second thing is to determine the operation tied to the variable. Is something being added to the variable or subtracted? That's called a constant. Is something multiplying or dividing the variable? That's called a coefficient. And you need to figure out what that operation is, because step 3 is to undo that operation. Use an inverse. So an inverse operation is what we have down here in red. The opposite of addition is subtraction, and the opposite of subtraction is addition. The opposite of multiplication is division, and the opposite of division is multiplication. So once you identify the operation that is being performed, you're going to choose the inverse of that. And in order to isolate your variable, you need to use that opposite operation on both sides of the equal sign. Let's take a look at an example. Question number 1. X plus 7 equals -1. First, identify your variable. There it is. Second, determine the operation tied to that variable. Then third, use the inverse of that. So the opposite of adding 7 is subtracting 7. And don't forget to be fair. That means to use it on both sides of the equal sign. Some students find it helpful if they draw a line down the center of the equal sign like that. It's not necessary, but some students find that helpful. Once you use your property of equality, you're going to get an inverse, right? Something that either is an additive inverse, which means it adds to 0, which is what we have here, or something that's called a multiplicative inverse, which we'll see later on. Now, you may need a calculator to help you out with some of these integers today. So some of you have a calculator that looks like the one on the left, and some of you are using an internet calculator, like the one that looks on the right here. This is the Desmo Scientific Calculator. So if you're using a TI-30X2S, you might need the negative key. So on this calculator, the subtraction key and the negative key are different. But on the Desmos calculator, it's the same. The negative key and the subtraction key are the same on the Desmos calculator. So the next thing you're going to do in order to solve these problems is you're going to enter -1 on your calculator, and then you're going to press subtract 7. -1 subtract 7. And that gives us a -8. If you want to check your work, you take this value and substitute it in for x. So instead of an x plus 7, we're going to put our answer, -8 plus 7. And it does check. All right, watch me solve a couple of more here. Identify my variable and do the inverse operation. Use my calculator to solve. So I'm going to speed up a little here, but notice that I am using a property of equality. I'm not writing the math that I'm actually doing. So take a look at number 3. Sometimes I see students do this. So that is the math that I'm going to perform for this problem, but it doesn't show my actual property of equality. And that's what we're working on learning. Okay, we don't solve equations to practice our subtraction. We solve equations to get good at using properties of equality. So I really need to see this step here. Now my marker's a little fat, so it kind of takes up a lot of space, but you may want to draw that line down the center of the equal sign just to make sure you're doing something on both the left and right sides. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip the check step. Identify my variable, use an inverse operation. Notice how I'm crossing out these inverses. Sometimes I cross it out, sometimes I don't. It's up to you, but you'll never see me write the 0. Alright, if they are additive inverse and they make a 0, I'm not going to write that down because 0 plus w isn't necessary to write. So if it cancels out to a 0, then I leave it as such. Alright, last one here. Positive 4, or add 4. Alright, I just showed you 6 questions in which my inverse operation was either adding or subtracting, because every single problem on this page had a constant. Right? A constant is a number you are adding or subtracting to the variable. So I used adding or subtracting to solve all of these 6 questions. So let's take a look at the other kind. What if you have a coefficient? Now you can't see it, but there's a tiny little multiplication sign right in between that 4 and that letter A. And there's a tiny multiplication sign between that -7 and that P. But that's not what's going on with question number 9. Question number 9 has an operation you can actually see. It's a division sign. So remember, it's always about the inverse. So the inverse of multiplying 4 times A is dividing by 4. And you're going to do that on both sides. Now this does not become a 0. It becomes a 1. 4 divided by 4 is 1. Now although this is a correct answer, we as mathematicians, we never write a coefficient of 1. Right? It's like if somebody asked you your age. You wouldn't say 13 over 1, even though that is true. So we're going to leave that coefficient of 1 invisible. Alright, moving along. Number 8 is also a multiplication problem, so I'm going to use this division bar here to show that my multiplicative inverses cancel out on the right, and my solution on the left is positive 8. Now for number 9, I already have a division sign next to my variable, so I don't use division again. Now when you show multiplication as you're moving into high school, you don't use a time sign, and you don't even really use the dot anymore. We're going to graduate now to the set of parentheses. So I'm going to multiply both sides of my problem by 5. I'm going to show it with parentheses. Now, notice I also wrote the negative sign here. Now, number 11 is a little bit tricky because there is no number on the same side as the variable k. But there is a negative sign. And if there's a negative sign and no number, no coefficient, technically it's that sneaky invisible 1. So I'm going to divide both sides by -1, and that's how I get my final answer. That is how you solve a one-step equation with integers. Try these on your own. Good luck!